Artificial intelligence is remaking marketing as we speak, and if you're a marketer, you can either get up to speed or get left behind. The choice is yours, and really, it's a no-brainer. Join Geoff Livingston and Greg Verdino as they explore the latest AI news, trends, tools, and ideas that are creating the future of marketing today. This is No Brainer, an AI podcast for marketers. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, yes, I am an AI. Take it away, Geoff and Greg.
Hey, this is Greg Verdino, and I am here with Geoff Livingston, who is conducting the choir, it appears. How are you, Geoff?
Very good, my friend. Welcome back. We missed you last time.
Thank you so much. Great episode. As I've said to you offline, you have all the fun without me, but I'm glad you were able to hold the fort down, put a good show out, and keep the ball rolling.
Babbling about Hollywood and the Terminator. I don't know.
I don't know. It's crazy. It's crazy. Happy Halloween. We are recording this on October 31st. It'll be hitting the airwaves, the digital airwaves, on November 1st. But today is, in fact, Halloween. Are you all set for some trick-or-treating?
Oh, yeah. We got the candy stash. We love this holiday. You know, it's right around our kid's birthday, so it's always awesome. I even have Darth Vader right behind me and a little Dia de la Muertos.
Look at that. Awesome.
How about you?
So we've got a good episode today for everybody. I actually thought we had done an episode on a similar topic once before. I'm sure we discussed it as part of an episode, but it turns out that we didn't. So this one should be pretty interesting. So obviously, a lot of people are using image generators. Things like Midjourney and Dall-E 3 and so on and so forth. And a lot has happened since the last episode, even in the world of image generation. A lot of movement, a lot of stuff going on. OpenAI integrated Dall-E 3 into ChatGPT Pro. I finally have availability there. I'm hoping you do too.
Me too. Happened over the weekend.
Absolutely.
You and I are obviously not power users because we get it later than everybody else.
Right.
Which makes sense because we're probably more evolved AI users that don't use ChatGPT.
Maybe. Adobe's had some updates. A number of other companies have introduced some new features and functionality around image generation, including Amazon, but not in the land of large language models and sort of commercial grade generative AI. Interestingly enough, they are integrating it into a more specific use case, which is to help their advertisers, which is interesting since they are, of course, an 800-pound gorilla in online retail e-commerce advertising.
But very similar to Facebook, right? I know we'll get into this later, but like very targeted and business-minded.
Absolutely. And at the same time, while all of this is going on, we're starting to see the artists, who many of whom have been actively suing all of the large AI companies, not just writers, but visual artists as well, have been landing lawsuits left and right. But there are some interesting developments there, too, with a poison pill that artists can use to essentially infect their work in a way that will, or potentially could, render image generators far less effective than they are even today. So as all of this is going on, naturally marketers, whether you're an agency or an advertiser or a brand strategist, imagery is very near and dear to our hearts. And while I am not an artist myself, I certainly work with plenty of artists. You, of course, sir, are an artist as a photographer. Not a good one, I'll say that for sure. But no. Geoff is a very fine photographer.
I'm about to teach my first course in 2 years. I'm moving back into photography post eValue cert finally.
Nice. Well, I will say, in all seriousness, I've been nothing but impressed with the journey Geoff has been on, because I remember way back when the first time you picked up a camera, and all of the progress you've made and how great your photography has become over time.
Thank you.
So do check him out as a photographer. He's not just a mediocre podcaster. He is also a quite excellent photographer.
And I will say that AI has made me a better photographer in ways.
Right, because there, of course, are plenty of ways that artificial intelligence is woven into all of the applications you
Just
use.
like everything,
And
even the camera.
absolutely, absolutely right. It's right. It's
Yeah.
right there in the camera doing image stabilization and finding bird's eyes and whatnot. Right,
And inescapable.
inescapable. So it is everywhere. AI is everywhere. Speaking of everywhere, we are everywhere too. So if you are watching us
Well
on
done, dude.
YouTube, look at that. Watch out. We're looking through your bedroom window. If you are watching us on YouTube, it's Halloween. Uh,
Repeat.
if you're watching us on YouTube, please be sure to smash the like button and subscribe to our channel. Of course, feel free to leave us comments. We enjoy those when they are on point and relevant. Sometimes they're not, sometimes they're spam, but not our listeners. They give us the good stuff. And wherever you happen to be listening, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcast or any place else, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review No Brainer Podcast. Why don't we dive in, Geoff? Let's, I kind of did a bunch of rambling setup there, but why don't you bring us up to speed on the image generator landscape and some of the big changes that we see happening?
Yeah, and I think to your point, we have talked about these individually at points, particularly earlier in the podcast when we would cover more news. And even though this is like a newsy centric episode, I think people that listen to us know we don't like to cover the news. We like to analyze it. We like to dive a little deeper. And I think to do that, it'd probably be helpful to talk about image generators. And we'll put a timestamp in here in case you're familiar with the marketplace already. But most marketers don't know the full landscape. And so, before we talk about Firefly and Dall-E, which both had significant upgrades, and of course the Amazon image generator, we had a marketplace that for all intents and purposes was a 4-horse race, which was Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, Dall-E, and then of course Firefly. And Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, which did not upgrade last week or the last 2 weeks, were probably the better image generators. Midjourney was fantastic, probably the leader for people that were individuals. Stable Diffusion, the Enterprise Edition, fantastic. Really strong, particularly if you could afford that $500 a month fee to license it, right? So it's pro grade. And also, it's the choice for Amazon in their own system. And I wouldn't be surprised if Amazon's deployment is actually based off of Stable Diffusion, which makes a lot of sense, all things considered. That wasn't released that I could find, but you kind of get the perspective. Now, both Adobe and OpenAI were relevant not because their generators were good. They were actually kind of cartoonish and kind of cloddish, I would say, at least from my perspective. I don't know about yours. But because they had distribution, they were getting a lot of play. I mean, basically, OpenAI bundled Dall-E with anybody that was licensing GPT 3.5, Turbo, or 4. And that's for all the developers out there. And a lot of the reskinned cheapies that you're seeing out there, like HubSpots, are based off of Dall-E.
Yeah, and even, you look at some of the early brand experiments with generative AI, like Coca-Cola, where Coke could have chosen any image generation model in the world, but because of their tight partnership with Bain and OpenAI, Dall-E 3 became the default image generator things for things like Create Real Magic,
Right.
where I'm sure they could have had much better art had they worked with someone like a Stable Diffusion or
Found a way to work with Midjourney. Although I don't know of anybody working with Midjourney. Do you?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone who's got an official partnership, certainly, and
No.
I'd even wonder whether anybody.
I think it's like this ongoing university project.
Yeah, I don't know that I've even, at least to my eye, have recognized any Midjourney imagery popping up just that people are using.
We use it.
A lot of great experimentation.
Yeah, I've been seeing it in some advertising and stuff.
Okay.
But it's also the place where they created the Pope image. So everybody that saw that, right? It's very photoreal outside of the 8 fingers.
Right, yes.
And they got a new version coming. And of course, Firefly, which we talked about extensively in the past, is bundled with Adobe Creative Suite, and it's being integrated into all the Adobe apps, which is actually very smart because instead of relying on Firefly to create standalone images, what you have is Firefly being used to repair other images, which is actually very robust and helpful. And if you think about, again, the professional design community, the professional photography community, you have them locked in. And if you're going to give it to them for free, I mean, like, obviously it makes it a lot easier than paying $30 a month for Midjourney or, paying for Stable Diffusion. So, both these companies benefited from their distribution and already their strong market weight. I would say Midjourney really suffers, not just because of the lack of distribution, which may or may not be in their best interest based off of what they're trying to achieve, but also the interface is Discord. And AI people and tech people love Discord. Real people hate Discord unless they're 12 years old. And, it's really a teen app, it's a tween app, or it's in that tech community. This is where all the prompting stuff comes in because you really have to prompt Midjourney, right? Like you have to become pretty good at it.
And I understand they're working towards a standalone interface, which would improve matters for them. But I agree with you 100%. Discord is their Achilles heel. And 100%. I don't see them mainstreaming in the way some of these other tools could, even if they are technically better and visually superior, until they get outside of that world of kludgy Discord servers.
Totally agree. And I think that's like the big handicap on them really becoming widespread and the number one adopted image generator. Now, if they get acquired, that's the first thing anybody that does buys them, which I could also see happening. And in the case of Stable Diffusion, they're I think they suffer from being small. I mean, they have some bigger partners, but they are kind of like the little engine that could compared to OpenAI and Adobe. And also their interface isn't great either, to be candid. I don't really like it. I think it's kind of primitive. It's hard to use and resize, and they could definitely benefit from a stronger UI. So that's where we are now. Now let's set the table. Greg, do you want to go into what happened with Adobe first?
Sure. So Adobe, obviously, some months ago announced Firefly and started to roll out sort of beta, I guess I would call it, integration into some of their applications. And certainly I think it was a welcome addition to their suite where it was available, but it wasn't quite ready for prime time in terms of the quality of the output and the level of sophistication. But in the course of the past few weeks, they've begun to make some significant moves. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it is now available across all of their applications.
Correct.
And you're probably a much heavier user than I am, but it is in most importantly Photoshop, it's in Illustrator, it's in Adobe Express, which is
they're really pushing Illustrator Canva, now.
Right, competitor. And what's interesting is that while you can in fact use Adobe Generative AI to create images from scratch, a lot of their features and functionality come down to ways to manipulate existing images. Things like generative fill and generative expand, which allow you to do things like change backgrounds or kind of blow out kind of like the background, from a small shot to a huge wide angle, let's say. You can do things like recolor using generative AI in Illustrator, and I believe probably in Photoshop too, right? Take Geoff's black shirt and make it a red shirt. And confuse the world. Because Geoff would never wear a red shirt, right? So there's all sorts of tools like that.
Might be surprised
that are rolled out across the applications. At the same time, I know, as you said earlier in their evolution, the images that Adobe Firefly created tended to be kind of more Illustrator-like or cartoonish. And now they've definitely taken a step up we can discuss whether it's a big enough step up, but they've taken a step
Yeah.
up to
We
much more
should.
photorealistic.
Because
Much
I
more,
definitely toyed around with them
yeah,
after the releases. I don't know if you did, but
a little bit.
a little bit. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like there's a couple of things. I still don't think either of them are there. I think progress, but they haven't gotten the cigar yet. That's my big macro takeaway. But in the case of Adobe's got so many freaking filters on their generator to prevent people from doing things that are, shall we say, a little slim shady.
Right.
But it's become so PC that basically it won't do anything. And I put out that blog to help promote the last episode with the 5 AI ghouls.
Yeah.
And I had to use Midjourney to create a picture of the Terminator pointing a gun. Right. And that's literally what the prompt was, the Terminator pointing a gun. I don't really get, too in depth because I know that some of these images have already been rendered well. So in the case of Midjourney, clearly they had indexed the Terminator. They had an Arnold picture. It was an older Arnold. It wasn't the original T-800. And they were able to point a gun in the rain in a dystopian scene. Firefly would even produce an image. In fact, when I did finally get to produce images, it was like white people smiling in office wear. And I'm like, this isn't what I want. Now, the images were good. I mean, you can tell that they've indexed a lot of stock photography with people in it. And so the people images are a lot better than, actually, I would say, competitive with Midjourney and Stable Diffusion. But getting it there, man, woof, really painful.
It's, I think that's a case where sort of a benefit is also a hindrance, right? Because, one of the advantages they have, at least on paper, is if you are working at or on behalf of an enterprise brand, those kinds of guardrails, the fact that the model is trained on rights cleared images, everything's properly licensed, you're not going to worry about piracy and IP and copyright issues and all those things in terms of what's brought into your art. The fact that you can't kind of, a rogue art director can't go off the rails and start producing images with spokespersons or the likeness of a spokesperson that could get you into trouble, or something like a gun that might, all these things.
The gun thing, yeah. I mean, I could see why that's that way, but I would also say that 51% of the population would probably not feel that way.
Well, you've got the flip side, right?
And if you're in a more conservative-oriented business, and just so everybody's clear, I do not support using guns in any way. I just want that put out there. We're in this very PC era, and I would say that I definitely do not support what we've been seeing that's happening in society with that kind of thing. But that being said, we're marketers. And we know that 50-some% of the brands out there cater to that audience. And that's part of the gig, man. If you're on a more conservative brand, then that's the imagery that you may want to use, particularly if you're in a rural setting, okay? And there are a lot of companies that do that kind of work. And you can't use Adobe. You can't use Adobe AI. Right. That's just gone.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over time, right? Whether it becomes less restrictive over time, whether it stays just as restrictive, and I guess we'll see. And it might just have certain use cases and other use cases where it doesn't make sense.
Alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and marijuana, forget it, man. It's the whole ATF thing from advertising. It's what side of that fence you sit on. So anything like that, out, right? And then the other thing that I found disappointing about that Terminator thing, and I'm just being candid here, is that conceptually, I understand not showing Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I do think you could show an image of something that looks like basically a nasty robot, right? That looks like a T-series monster.
Right. And something that plays to the cultural reference, right?
Interpretive, right? And it's just not there. And so whenever people, this is the whole AI argument, is it intelligent, is it not? I do think that if you consider intelligence to be doing something that requires thought, that these algorithms have gotten to that point where you could consider it to be at least some sort of action that humans would have to think through doing. But the lack of creative capability in AI really comes through there. And the algorithms haven't advanced to the point to give AI license to do that kind of interpretation off of a stated social zeitgeist.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent some of these limitations, not all of the limitations, but I wonder to what extent some of the limitations, especially quality limitations in a tool like Adobe, are less of a challenge in the sense that if you're a prosumer or a consumer using a Midjourney or a Dall-E 3, which we're going to get into in a minute, that's one thing, right? You might not have any real understanding of how to now go in and edit and modify and really tweak a file to make it yours. Whereas if you're an Adobe user and you're already an expert at Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever, I'm wondering if the idea is, at least for now, as of October 31st, 2023, a good enough tool is still going to provide a great designer or photo editor or art director with raw source material that they can make their own and really perfect, deal with the six fingers and all that kind of stuff in a way that is professional. That doesn't get you around issues like constraints around alcohol, tobacco, and firearms.
Right. Those are ethical. Those are ethical choices.
Right. That's an ethical thing, but I'm wondering, you know what I'm saying? Kind of like as a semi-pro photographer, you could take something that looks reasonably photorealistic, get into Photoshop, and make it really sing.
Right. In fact, I would say that's the difference between good photographers and bad ones. I mean, even Ansel Adams was a master in the darkroom.
Right. So is that, I'm wondering through that lens, if you're an agency art director, is good enough, at least as a starting point to spark the next phase of creativity, right?
I think so, right? And I think one of the things that we've seen from an innovation standpoint with AI that people don't talk a lot about is, part of people that are experienced workers that kind of know what they want, but maybe they're like 7/10 of the way there and they plug in their prompt, which is, by the way, if you want to be a great prompter, just use a creative brief and plop that in there and see what you get back, because you'll be really surprised at how good of a prompt it is. There you go, the tip to prompting. But
I was telling a client that just the other day. It's like you don't have to learn how to prompt. You have to, like, if you know how to write a creative brief,
you know how to prompt.
That should give the model everything it needs to know to get you most of the way where you want it to go.
Just like you would prompt an artist. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh. But anyway, all right, let's not go down that rabbit hole. But I do think if you're 7/10 or 6/10 of the way there, you drop that brief in there, you're going to get some iterations that go, not that, but that's close. I could take it here, right? It can help you crystallize and help be part of your creative process. Yeah, I think you're right on that.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to sort of the other end of the market.
Dall-E,
ChatGPT, our friends at OpenAI.
Yeah. So I think this is the first big step to their multimodal.
Right. So, Dall-E 3 is, of course, first and foremost a substantial improvement over Dall-E 2.
Right.
But really
still cartoony.
Right. It's still not fantastic. But it is their model continues to get better. But the real action comes in the way they have now integrated Dall-E 3 with ChatGPT, or fundamentally GPT-4, and served it up within, for most users, ChatGPT Plus. Right. So if you were a Plus user,
it's play, right?
Yeah. So now essentially what happens is you can put a text prompt into ChatGPT, and it will return an image result. So, whatever it is, generated image of, 3 turtles sitting on a rock, and it will give you back a couple of options of 3 turtles sitting on a rock. As Geoff said, more cartoony than photorealistic in my experience.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is
Even
that,
when you tell it to be photorealistic,
right.
by the way.
But that's in the capability, I think, of the image generation model. But what's interesting is essentially what's happening is ChatGPT is making an API call to the Dall-E algorithm, and which then sends the image data back to ChatGPT. So
I
you're
was going
getting
to say that it's basically acting like a force plugin.
exactly. But what's interesting about that is certainly GPT-4 is a much more powerful large language model than than the kind of sort of text natural language processing you see in something like, I'm sure, an Adobe or a Midjourney, right? So it actually is fairly easy to prompt in plain language.
Yes, it is.
Then, without having to understand all of the intricacies of, kind of visual vocabulary, and get something that's acceptable.
I decided to give it a real kick in the teeth and try it out with a campaign I was building for a client. And so what I did was, or a partner that I'm doing this Association AI Day conference that I'm co-hosting with Association Trends and Association Chat on Monday coming up. Register if you want, if you're in DC. But the thing is with it, what I did was I wrote up the copy. I took a transcript from a mini podcast I did with our keynote, Amber Ivy, who's a fantastic lady. She's been in ML and AI for about a decade now, really smart person. But I took the transcript from that 15-minute conversation. I slapped it into ChatGPT. I said, take this and turn it into a podcast notes. Did that relatively well. Needed some editing, of course, but good enough for me to take it from 5 tests to 8 tests and clean it. Then I had it write the social media post. Did okay with that. Again, I don't really get too picky with it. I just pull it out and edit it, once it gets close enough. And then I told it to create an image prompt based off of the whole thing. And it did. And then I said, great, now make the image. And it came back, and even though it was cartoony, it was pretty good except for one thing. And outside the cartoony thing, I asked it to be photoreal, could not do it, kicked back another cartoon. And then, I could have put in some of the prompts I use with Midjourney, like Nikon, give me a Z1 image or a Z9 image. Sorry, there's no Z1. Give me a Z9, that kind of stuff. But it came back with a conference setting, big screen, keynote. Everybody was white. Everybody was white. Now, again, back to our creative brief conversation, did I tell it to be diverse? No. But I did do what everybody else that's a jack shit crap marketer is going to do, which is basically, I'll let the AI just do it. Mm-hmm. Right. Instead of coming back and prompting it. And to me, it was really disappointing because what it did was it revealed the bias, right? That all of its large conference images are of white people,
Yeah.
And so right away, Dall-E 3 is biased.
Right. Which, I think, obviously everyone knows it's part of the conversation. And I don't know if there's a real plan to address that kind of bias. But it is a challenge, right? It's...
Yeah. Every marketer, I would just take it, and this is maybe bad on my part, but I just take it for granted that you would think not to put a bunch of white people in an image.
Right.
With like 20 people.
You have a theory of the world and an understanding of what
my theory is wrong.
Whereas the AI does not. And of course, that's a big piece of the conversation around like what is intelligence and blah, 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 not to go theoretical, I know. But there is that whole idea of that is certainly a difference between human intelligence and machine intelligence is we have real experience of how the way the world works. We have real experience of what current social and moral and ethical and, cultural norms are. Even if the reality in many cases still seems to be. It's, the vast majority of people on the stage are male, pale, and stale like we are. There's,
Ball. Better they ball.
the
No.
real
No.
exactly. There is of course, a sensitivity to that these days that an AI might not be clued into, right? So, certainly we have that kind of challenge.
Yeah.
But
So yeah. So not quite there, right? There's some problems. But let's be honest, because of the bundle, we're going to see a lot of people using this, right? And
yeah,
I mean, it's just OpenAI has an unfair advantage compared to the other. Well, I don't think it's unfair. They've earned
they
it,
have an
right?
advantage.
They've earned it. And it's a competitive marketplace, but they have that advantage and they're making everything of it because really, I don't think Dall-E would be around anymore based off of Dall-E
Right, if it was
2's
a standalone.
crap performance
Yeah.
if they weren't bundling it.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't, unlike Adobe and Firefly, I don't necessarily see, a lot of Fortune 50 brands going to ChatGPT Plus and cranking out a bunch of
No.
$3 images. So it's really a different audience. It's either a prosumer or a consumer.
Or
where good enough
technologists,
is
all
good
these
enough,
Silicon Valley
right?
idiots.
Or it's a Silicon Valley nerd.
Sorry if you're
or
there.
It's a smaller brand that can't otherwise afford illustration, right? So it's a bit of a different market where having integrated, easy access to a workable solution is better than having nothing.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So we're going to move over to Amazon. We suspect that this was built with Stable Diffusion since they are licensing that and putting it out via their cloud services on AWS. And in the press release, Amazon says Amazon Ads has launched image generation beta. Basically, we don't know if it's great, and we want to make sure that we have legal bias for legal grounds for saying, whoops, we didn't realize I could do that. It's a generative AI solution designed to remove creative barriers and enable brands to produce lifestyle imagery that helps improve their ads performance. This is a really smart domain-specific approach to using generative AI, and it's not unsimilar to what Google's done with their own search ads and what Meta is doing with its social networks and the AI it's deploying now and there promises to deploy in there per that episode we did a month ago. And I think that this is really kind of like where we're going to start seeing AI move over the next year in marketing, where enough of this, like, wow, we have this thing, it could do this. I wonder what people will do with it, and as opposed to businesses being like, look, we don't really care what else you could do with our image generator. We think it should be working in your ads, and we think this is the best way to monetize it. And this makes a ton of sense, I think, because you have a lot of small mom and pops that are in the Amazon marketplace that can't create ads, and you have larger businesses that, if this is as good as Stable Diffusion, are probably going to take advantage of it, at least iterating their own already existing creative and providing new options. Like you had said, give Geoff that red t-shirt this time, give my model the blue shirt this time, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And Amazon in its release also says 75% of its advertisers cited building ad creatives and choosing a creative format as their biggest challenge. So they know that there's a hunger for this.
Yeah.
I think it's got a lot of legs. It's got a lot of implications, though, for creative agencies. My friend, you're much more the advertising guru here. I'm going to dish to you for your analysis.
Yeah, I think that, sort of the stat that you cited, about 75% saying building ad creatives is a challenge for them. And, this is 75% of a pretty big market. I think Amazon's ad business is something like $12 billion a year, if I'm not mistaken. And I think they represent something like 80 or 90% of all digital retail media spend. So that's not surprising, right? Because they're the 800-pound gorilla of e-commerce stores. And a lot of that money obviously is related, as you pointed out, to marketplace sellers. So it really, in a lot of ways, levels the playing field there. Because if you're a major brand, you're a Hanes, and you're selling T-shirts, you can certainly afford to have a shoot with pro models on a pro set with a nice background, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and present your product in the proper light that attracts buyers and gets them excited and lights up eyeballs and gets them to click buy. If you're a no brand, kind of like no logo in the back of the shirt kind of T-shirt seller, chances are you're not going to be able to have the same kind of product presentation. So what this really does is it allows those guys to present their product in a better light, to make the product more appealing. To I know the press release or the article blog post about the announcement, showed a toaster, right? And instead of shooting a toaster on a plain white background in a light box or whatever, you can now put a background and make it look like it's in a beautiful high-end kitchen, right? When you present your product like that in situ, it obviously looks far more appealing. The buyer can picture it in their home a bit better, and it also, frankly, makes your product appear better than it would have on a plain white background in those cases. So it really levels that playing field, I think, for the little guys. I think at the same time, it is potentially disruptive for sort of retail type ad agencies. There are a lot of ad agencies that are all about making your product pop on Amazon. And they work even with big brands, right? So, when
I can see this taking the bottom part of their business and eating it.
I mean, the highest end obviously is going to continue to be the highest end, but there are so many instances where if you've got, a bottle of a soft drink or a water or a package of, cosmetics or whatever, shoot it on a green screen or a plain white background or whatever, and just replace it out seasonally or show it in different scenarios and situations is so much faster and cheaper than hiring a real photographer. So there is that potential to kind of eat the bottom of that market out. I think the downside to me is I already know, many people, it's not just me, know that legitimate brands often find themselves struggling because of the algorithm and because of the way Amazon presents search results, and because there's just so much junk in
there's a ton of crap out there.
That,
oh my God.
That a legitimate,
you got to be a prompter to get what you want on Amazon.
Right. But for every one legitimate product, that a manufacturer has paid good money to develop and maybe even has, patent protection around, there's going to be an illegally produced, cheaply produced knockoff. And one of the advantages that, in theory, the legitimate rights holder of the original product has is they can afford to spend a little bit more on marketing. They can present the product in a way that elevates it visually in the in the e-commerce space. Now all of a sudden, every cheap knockoff from China or Indonesia or wherever that's made for pennies on the dollar and will fall apart after the second or third use has the potential to look just as good, if not better, than the original product. So I think it's going to exacerbate the challenge that these kinds of brands have, because all of a sudden the junk you're trying to compete against that Amazon's serving up is going to look and feel just as good as the thing that you're selling at a premium.
Right. No, that makes sense. I mean, it'll be disruptive in some ways, and I think there is going to be a pinch, though. I do feel like this is one of these things where our brethren, our sisters, are going to feel, particularly smaller agencies, but also the larger ones. They're going to lose that bottom third of the market that struggles to pay for this. Like if
and I think
if you're in the beverage marketplace, we know Gatorade and Coke and all those guys have the money, but like if you're like a UCAN, or a smaller like Nun type of hydration drink, and I know these only because of the running thing, but like they're smaller brands.
Right.
They're the ones that are going to cut this. They're the ones going to use that AI.
Yeah. And I think overall it's, a good move. I think, I agree with you. It's I agree that it's smart for Amazon. Certainly, it's a great benefit for a lot of their advertisers. It
Yep.
is, it is, I think, as you said, indicative of a movement we're going to see more and more in the AI market, from the sort of general purpose, do what you will tool sets down to very specific use cases where the technology is closely paired with a real world application.
Yep.
And I think it makes a lot of sense from all those perspectives. And
Yeah.
I think at the same time, um, the benefits will outweigh the challenges, I think, for most brands.
Sure. I mean,
And
it just sucks for marketers, right?
well, I think that,
I
if
mean,
you're,
marketing agencies.
yeah.
Sorry.
But I was going to say, though, while it can suck for agencies, particularly if you're a specialist Amazon agency,
Right.
I think that there will be sort of the dividing line between those who buck against this and those who figure out how to integrate this effectively into their
Right.
workflows to
Diversion.
deliver better services more efficiently. And I think they could win in this scenario.
I agree with that. Yeah, totally. Um, I know we were going to talk a little bit about Shutterstock, with their approach where they seem to be, not accepting AI generated images. Although I think that at Macon they said that they do from their own stock of people, um, but they now allow buyers to use generative AI to edit photos. They're for license on site, which is kind of like what Firefly's doing. I kind of feel like Shutterstock's being conservative. They're playing a, a kind of a safe game, kind of seeing how this thing plays out. But I do know that they're actively experimenting with it. So maybe they're just kind of taking a wait and see approach and letting everybody else figure out what's the ethical quandary of it. And I mean, I think the one thing that Shutterstock and Getty face from the stock perspective is that, like everybody else on the image generation side, they have to deal with Adobe, and Adobe is like actively pumping these
Yeah.
AI generated images
Yeah.
into there. I mean, there are clearly people that are very good at using Firefly, because I look at some of the stuff that I'm seeing on Adobe stock. I use Adobe stock. Um, the AI art's fantastic, and I'm like, how do these guys use Firefly to create this? Because
Right.
I would love to see the prompts for those, man. I'm like, man, 'cause everything that I see coming out of there is pretty crappy, but I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe I just create Muppets on
Yeah.
Firefly. What do I
I don't
know?
know. I mean, I think that, whether, I mean, I guess whether it's, Shutterstock or Getty or Adobe or whatever, I think, when you're looking at the stock market, stock imagery market, to be
Yeah, I
clear,
was about to say, please don't. It's been
let's not
painful,
look at
that
the stock
correction.
market
Ah!
right now, but the stock imagery market, I think that it kind of is, a lot of these applications of sort of the features, we kind of fall into that general category of AI is not a product, it's a feature, right? And the when you whether they're doing a good implementation at this particular moment in time or whether it leaves room for improvement, um, and whether you think they're being conservative or aggressive with how they're integrating AI in, it only makes sense that if you are in the business of visual imagery, as within the context of this show, that you need to be thinking about what kinds of AI features and functionality can you bake into your offering as part of your native solution so that people don't need to be bouncing around. And I mean, they'll do it nonetheless anyway, right? But to some extent, but the extent to which you allow somebody, say, who's looking at a Shutterstock image, but hey, I need, three of the people in orange shirts because my corporate color is orange, or I need to apply this kind of a filter, or I need it to be a wider shot with some copy space, or I need fewer white guys and more women of color, and modify an existing stock image. I think that kind of thing makes the product so much more versatile.
I wonder what they're doing with their licensing agreements now with image creators, because I could see, because just knowing photographers are just so persnickety about this kind of thing. Like I could just see some of them being like, "You can't alter my image."
Right. And I
Yeah,
don't know, I don't know that angle. I know that they've made a point of saying that even if, when somebody purchases an image that they have modified through prompts,
they
that
have
the
to
original source
credit.
photographer will still be credited and will still be paid. But, to your point, and I don't know, I mean, I know, like, sound I don't want this to come out the wrong way. Like, I know, like, a real photographer will be very persnickety about that stuff. The
You
extent to
took
which,
my
to the
image of Joe Biden and altered it.
yeah, to the extent to which a non-editorial stock photographer is that
Yeah,
persnickety, I don't know.
I don't know.
Um,
Somebody that's making a lot of bank off of Shutterstock probably
right,
knows the game. You
right.
know?
They just figure I'm happy to sell. It's
Yeah.
a volume play, I assume.
And I assume too, if you're an elite photographer, maybe you can get away with that. But
Right,
knowing also the photography marketplace, even the very best have to scrap for money. It's a lot like the music business, where you have to be basically Taylor Swift or you're scum. You
right.
know, and not that everybody that performs and issues records is scum, but you know what I mean. From a financial standpoint, there's an elite level, and then there's the rest, and the rest is just about 99%.
Right, right, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Let's
While
move
we're on
on. Let's move
while we're on
on.
the subject of the rest,
Nightshade.
the rest fight back. So we've spoken about this sort of challenge on other shows, of course, and we've even spoken about some of the pushback. But as I'm sure everybody who listens to this program knows, there is a lot of um, complexity around the extent to which the large AI model developers like OpenAI and Google and Meta and all of the others are scraping internet data, right? They've essentially scraped the entire internet plus a whole bunch of other assets and resources and stockpiles of data in order to train their models. And we've
Right.
spoken before, for example, about how the pile, which includes the full text of 180,000 or so books, including mine, but more importantly from, authors like Stephen King and so on and so forth, have made their way into the training set for models like GPT-4. We've spoken about Sarah Silverman, for example, who has pursued a lawsuit against
Right.
against OpenAI and I believe others. We've spoken about how some of the large mainstream media publishers have taken the step of blocking OpenAI's crawler. So, for example, New York Times can no longer be crawled by OpenAI.
Thank
Um,
God.
right? Right.
Well, I mean, what were we going to do without the New York Times in there?
But fundamentally, the question becomes when a large language model, when the next round of training comes around, and as they're building GPT-5 and GPT-6 and 10 and 12 and 50, assuming we stick with this LLM
Right.
based AI, which is
Well,
not a sure shot thing, right?
we're seeing the value of data for
They will,
sure.
but
Yeah.
certainly there is a question as to whether these models would become less effective over time as the highest quality writing is being protected from a crawl, right? Um, whether you agree with the content of the writing is a different story, but certainly the typical New York Times reporter is a competent writer. Certainly, Stephen King is an evocative story, an imaginative storyteller, right?
Right.
So if all of a sudden a model can't train on these things and instead is training on a bunch of AI generated content or Reddit shit posts or tweets or whatever, that fundamentally changes what the model will be capable of doing. So,
This is what everybody's talking about, right? You get what
right,
you pay for. When you're crawling a bunch of free stuff, you're going to get free crap.
right.
Yeah.
So, the other side of it, as it relates to the world of imagery, visual arts, is that, certainly many artists have found that the image generators are using their internet published artwork as training material. And so much so that in many cases you could even ask Midjourney to replicate a specific artist's style, and
Right.
it will do a damn good job of replicating that artist's style. The kind of thing that might get you or me sued for a forgery,
No,
popped out
I've
of
done
Midjourney.
images of Washington D.C. that landmarks that look like stuff that I've seen on Instagram that either I or a handful of
Right,
photographers I know in the local community could do, but not many others could. So I
right,
mean, it's clear to
right.
me that
It's clear,
like it's
right?
clear that it's being indexed.
Right, so what's happening now, which is an interesting development, is some developers are providing artists with tools that allow those artists to essentially embed a poison pill into artwork that they publish online.
Right.
So the latest of these is a tool called Nightshade, which I guess is appropriate. We are recording on Halloween. Nightshade. We should do some kind of like wah ha 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 kind of. But it was developed by a team working under a gentleman named Ben Zhao. I don't know Ben Zhao at all, except that I know that he's a professor at the University of Chicago, presumably working in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And they had previously released a tool called Glaze. And what Glaze allowed an artist to do was to sort of embed data into an image that would essentially mask the artist's style.
Right.
So
Poison pill it.
right, so that if it looked to you and me like, I don't know, some kind of like a high fantasy kind of novel cover, to the AI it might look like a Porky Pig cartoon, right? It's kind of that kind of thing. So
There's an
my
image.
understanding is Nightshade kind of goes a step deeper, where the poison pill will do something like, the art will look fine to the human eye, but pixels will be altered in a way that will change the meaning of those pixels to an artificial intelligence.
Right.
So, a cat becomes a cow, a dog becomes a duffel bag, or whatever.
It's playing off of the language of electronics, which is ones and zeros, versus the language of humans, which is visual. Because in reality, we know that AI can't see the imagery; it just comes to
Right,
recognize shapes
right.
based off of computational likelihood. I mean, everything's probability with AI.
Right. So essentially, what happens is, if some substantial number of artists embed this nightshade poison pill into their artwork, and next time an OpenAI or a Google or Stable Diffusion or anybody, Midjourney comes around to scrape the internet's worth of art, and this artwork is included in that scrape, that artwork will essentially arrive infected or corrupted into the large language model, right?
Yeah.
And then my understanding is, because not the large language model, but the model, the algorithm.
Right.
And then my understanding from what I've seen is, because of the way a lot of these algorithms work, if, for example, it's a picture of a dragon, um, because that the concept of dragon will be correlated with the concept of fantasy,
Right.
which will then in turn be correlated with the concept of Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and the Khaleesi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that all of these things could potentially become infected in a way that the next time somebody prompts Midjourney for a high fantasy image featuring a dragon, that person will end up with something that looks totally unlike what they're asking for.
Sure.
So the idea is that it kind of propagates across the algorithm in a way that essentially renders a lot of prompts useless. So it's
Right. And
this
it's hard to
idea,
find the images and get rid of
right, and
them
then
and
right, you can't
unpollute the
find the
pool.
bits and bobs and pixels and whatnot that are spread throughout the entire algorithm. So, or the data set. So, what's interesting about it is it's a very devious way to kind of
I don't
it's like,
know. It's kind of like a hacker getting reverse hacked, right?
right.
But the thing is like, how does the average photographer, for example, or the average illustrator get this in there? Do they put it in Adobe? Is Adobe going to let them do this?
Well, that's
No.
the question, right? I
Yeah,
don't
right.
know how
Like,
they figured
so
out.
you have to go on the site and embed it in your pixels. So, I mean, I could see this not getting far. I could see it being used by some. And I can also see, I mean, frankly, let's be brutally honest. I mean, just like cybersecurity, these guys are going to figure out what the code is, and then they're going to recognize images and spit them right back out. Like I don't know.
Maybe, right?
Oh,
Because
come on,
right,
come on.
because we know. Well, here's the problem, though. Like right now, we know for a fact that like ChatGPT or GPT-4 can't recognize AI generated text. We know that.
But I guarantee you this has a
There's,
signature. I
any
guarantee you it has a
like
signature.
any technology around watermarking or signatures or protection or whatever are very difficult right now. Like they're like very nascent and hard to implement and hard as this will be, right?
Right.
So I think it's there could
But it
potentially
doesn't
be
have
one of
to
these,
pull it out. It
right?
just has to throw out the image.
Right. Assuming it
Right.
can identify it, right?
If it can
Well,
identify it, it just doesn't index it.
yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I agree with you. I don't know how big of an impact it will have. I don't know how many artists are likely to actually do it
Yeah.
based on whether it will be difficult or not.
It'll be interesting to see too, frankly, because there is like in all the things that Adobe touches, because like every other kind of large player, they have lots of little competitors and little segments.
Yeah.
So in the design space and in the video and photography editing space, it has competitors.
Sure.
Like Aperture and Luminar and all these other little players. I could easily see them maybe licensing this and selling to photographers and being like, oh, if you use Adobe, your stuff's going to instantly be indexed, protect your works.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
then let's get back to the Shutterstock example, though. Does Shutterstock accept images from people that use Nightshade?
Right. Yeah, I think it's less about, to me, it seems like it's less about, like, first of all, less about photography than it is about, like, other forms of visual arts. I get the sense that the people who are most excited about this are, like, illustrators or
Sure.
digital artists who have a unique style. Like the woman who I believe did all of, like, a lot of the illustration work for Animal Crossing, which is a very popular Nintendo game. I've seen her posting things about this and how excited she is because she's seen her work ripped off and her
Right.
style is popular enough that people are creating forgeries of it, and she has actually taken all of her artwork off, that she controls, off of the internet. So she has no online portfolio right now. And she intends to use tools like this to protect her own portfolio, knowing that, with a very popular art style, of course she would be a great candidate for the next scrape, right? And she's like, you know what? If you want to scrape my artwork and infringe on my intellectual property, then go ahead and poison your own model. See if I care. So we'll see what happens. I understand it's interesting because on the one hand, we've talked about, what is the value of content, right? And certainly there is like a whole kind of world of, hurt in the way these models have been trained, right? For
Right.
people who have invested, in many cases, their entire life's work into whether it's visual arts or video or text and thought leadership or whatever, stories, poetry, etc., where essentially you have a handful of tech bros saying, that's the property of the world. We are part of the world. We own your IP.
Right. But
right?
this is symptomatic of the larger debate.
Which is, whether something like a Nightshade specifically works.
But
I think
I'm still very skeptical
I
of
think it's indicative of essentially a pushback, right? A kind of a pushback against the grabbiness of big tech. And,
there
you
is
know,
a data war that's coming. It's really clear that, everybody is looking at walled gardens or protection mechanisms. Nightshade I agree with you that Nightshade is a symptom of that data war that's coming. If you look at all content forms in some way as data, that can either be protected or ingested. It's one or the other.
right.
Yeah, where do you sit in that? And I think we've talked about this before, but I don't think we've gotten really deep into the implications of it. Probably should. Maybe that's an episode later down the line. But you know, the problem with a tool like Nightshade and with some of the mechanisms that came out with ChatGPT, for example, for academics, to check whether or not something's spun back in the spring, is that it's kind of like a David versus Goliath situation. And, there has to be some sort of legal action or regulation to protect copyright to make these things have a lot more teeth. Otherwise, it's guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, yeah, right. And it's asymmetrical warfare, right? Because
Right.
it's like, you're building a company that's worth $80 billion or whatever the valuation of OpenAI is on the back of the work of somebody who maybe made $800, right?
It's
And
wrong. It's wrong.
there is something
There's a lot.
fundamentally wrong in that,
Yeah, yeah.
so I think that if nothing else, all of these lawsuits, depending on how they play out, and the emergence of tools like a Nightshade or a Glaze or anything else that might come, or even the extent to which Biden's executive order or other regulatory things in other regions even address the notion of copyright protection. The it raises awareness around the disparity and the sort of the not just the legal but even the ethical and moral issues around the way big tech uses whatever kind of data it is we put out there in the world. And that's been an issue that's far preceded this
Yeah, well,
generation of
it goes
artificial
back to
intelligence,
Meta,
right?
Twitter, and all those guys. By the way, say hi
Absolutely,
to the
right?
Rock. Yeah, that's my kid. I'm blaming my kid for that one. They like to sit on the rock.
Nice. I think on that note, I think
We've completely trolled our own show. Yeah.
I think we've done our job.
We should
here,
pick that up
Jeffrey.
though. Let's do that on another
Yeah,
episode for sure.
absolutely.
Yep.
But for now, let's call it a show. Let's
What's your
get
brainer, man?
do what's my brainer. Let's see. My brainer would be geez, I didn't even give thought to
Don't
a
sit on
brainer
the
this
rock.
week. It's one of those. What was that?
Don't sit on the rock.
Don't sit on the rock. That's the brainer. No, I would say, to me, the brainer this week really comes down to I think it's I find it to be even though I am not myself a visual artist, I find it to be a positive thing for the space that we are starting to see some real advancement and innovation. Less so maybe than less so maybe in the world of like the Shutterstocks and even Adobe, it is their model getting better and blah, 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 blah. But I would say more in the land of, say, an Amazon, where the innovation is becoming use case specific.
Tangible and useful.
And it's
right?
tangible and it's useful. There's a real business case. It solves a real problem. It's not it's not a solution in search of a problem.
Right.
And I think that the brainer is to me is that
get down to business, right?
We're getting down to business. We're getting to the real stuff. I kind of, when you think about the Gartner hype cycle and how was it whenever their last hype cycle for AI came out or for tech really, and generative AI was sitting right at the very tip tippity top of the peak, right? And, ready to go down that roller coaster ride into the trough of disillusionment. To me, like, while a lot of people will kind of fall away and go by the wayside and, forget about AI, and now the AI bros who are posting about prompting on LinkedIn 20 times a day will be on about who knows what, augmented reality or something, whatever's next for them. But I think what happens in that ride down the trough and into the trough is the people who intend to make good use of the tool get serious about it.
Yeah.
And, I think what we're starting to see is some of these even big tech companies get serious about providing real, tangible, practical solutions, not just pie in the sky, pipe dream, general purpose systems.
Right. They move away from hype to real.
Yeah. So I think, to me, as part of this brainer, it's like, if you're a marketer, keep your eye out for those kinds of opportunities, because those opportunities will be equally disruptive, right? The smaller agency or the Amazon retail agency specialist who doesn't get on board with these kinds of tools, who starts to feel the pinch. But then there will also be tremendous opportunity for finding ways to integrate these tools and innovate your own business model.
Right. I will say, for the no-brainer, we're looking at a horse race. So don't get wed to a tool, man. Just be willing to adapt and throw out tools whenever something new comes up. I mean, like, we made a joke at the beginning about not using ChatGPT, but I'm using Claude pretty much almost for like 70% of all my text work now. And, it's just because I find it matches my style better and what I really want from it. So, and I'm not wed to Claude. I'm wed to whatever works for me today. And I know that whatever AI I have today won't be anywhere near as good as what I have in 6 months. Yeah. So keep moving.
Yeah.
Keep moving.
That is so important, right? Put the tool to work for you. Don't work for the tool.
Exactly.
Right? And you don't want to get so fixated on the specific technology that you don't have the ability to pivot and adapt and evolve as the tool set changes.
As every HubSpot user on earth will tell you, being locked in. Oh. Did I go there? I did. On that happy note, everybody, if you are a regular listener or just listening for the first time, please rate us on iTunes. Give us a like on YouTube. Share it with your friends. Subscribe. We really, really appreciate it. We take feedback. Go to the nobrainerpodcast.com site. Send us a message. And of course, we look forward to seeing you in just 2 weeks, which will be our pre-Thanksgiving episode.